By the end of 1920, the world was beginning to settle down once more after the dreadful carnage of 1914-18 and its aftermath. The majority of states put their faith in the League of Nations, arms limitation agreements, and the redrawn map of Europe as ways of preventing future conflict. In other countries, domestic conditions and dissatisfaction at the outcome of the peace treaties brought new forces to the surface. Russia had suffered 4 years' turmoil from 1917, years which had caused her people untold suffering. The Civil War finally ended in 1920. Lenin and his victorious followers were faced with the awesome task of putting their country back on its feet. The economy was in ruins. Many of its people were starving and mistrustful of the communist regime. The Western democracies were not willing to help because they viewed the regime as a threat to their stability. Indeed, Comintern had been set up in Moscow in 1919 to export revolution abroad. Russia had not been invited to join the League of Nations, and no member officially recognized her regime. She was thus an outcast. In 1924, Lenin, worn out and debilitated, died. His task of stabilizing the country by no means completed, with the economy still in tatters. Most people believed that Trotsky would succeed him. Joseph Stalin, secretary of the Communist Party and the mustached figure on the right, thought otherwise. He began a subtle and at times ruthless campaign to seize the reins of power for himself. Germany, too, experienced a rough ride during the 1920s and early 1930s. The immediate aftermath of the Great War had been civil conflict between the extreme left and right, with what were in effect private armies recruited from soldiers returning from the war. This had been brought under control by the center-left democratic government installed just before the end of the war, but the swingeing terms of the Peace of Versailles merely served to aggravate the situation. The severe limits placed on the German armed forces, with tanks, aircraft and heavy artillery being banned, meant that they were hardly capable of defending Germany's borders. Germany also had to pay crippling reparations for the material damage she had inflicted during 1914-18, payments of which soon resulted in galloping inflation. It was the right who initially made the running. In March 1920, a senior army officer and others attempted to overthrow the government. The army refused to support the latter, and the government fled from Weimar to Dresden. Only a general strike saved it, and the fact the communists tried to take advantage of the confusion to mount a coup of their own, one that was put down by the army. All this showed how weak the government was. Difficulties in paying the reparations eventually resulted in French troops occupying the Ruhr, Germany's main industrial region, in January 1923. The French occupation increased resentment and resulted in even more severe inflation. It rose from 7,000 marks to the dollar to 1 million by August. The government had offered passive resistance and had halted all reparations payments, but by August realized that it was impossible to resist the Allies without bringing total collapse to the economy. Reparations payments therefore resumed, and the French withdrew. Both extreme left and right saw this as another indicator of the Weimar government's weakness, and unrest continued. This was especially so in Bavaria, where the scars of the 1919 Civil War had allowed right-wing groups to flourish. Among these was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, led by Adolf Hitler, an ex-wartime corporal of Austrian parentage. His charisma and attacks on the indignities of Versailles soon gained him increasing support. Hitler attracted powerful allies, including no less than Erich von Ludendorff, former chief of staff of the German army. In November 1923, Hitler and Ludendorff attempted a putsch in Munich, with the eventual aim of overthrowing the Weimar government and tearing up the Treaty of Versailles. It misfired, and both Hitler and Ludendorff were put on trial. While Ludendorff was acquitted of high treason, Hitler was sentenced to 5 years' imprisonment in the fortress of Landsberg, outside Munich. Public sympathy for him in Bavaria helped to reduce the term to 9 months, which he spent writing his political testimony, Mein Kampf. When released, he was banned from public speaking. Much of Hitler's appeal was based on his use of the popular notion that Germany had been stabbed in the back at the end of the war by weak politicians, and that the German armies had not been defeated. Germany needed strong government to restore her fortunes. Intertwined with this was a racial theory that argued that the Aryans were superior to all other human races, especially Jews. Hitler's propaganda chief, Joseph Goebbels, helped to put this message across. In May 1924, Charles G. Dawes, director of the U.S. Bureau of the Budget, introduced a revised plan for paying reparations. This enabled the German economy to start recovering. In 1927, the last Allied occupation troops, a constant reminder that Germany had been vanquished in 1918, were withdrawn from the Rhine. This was as a result of Germany's admission to the League of Nations the previous year. Consequently, support for Hitler's Nazis waned. But in 1927, the ban on Hitler's public speaking was lifted, and he decided to pursue the parliamentary path to power. In the 1928 elections to the German parliament, the Reichstag, however, the Nazis won only 12 seats out of 491, an indication that the country was achieving greater stability. This was dashed by the October 1929 Wall Street crash, which affected Germany's delicate economy more than any other. Unemployment soared and served to polarize public opinion to the communists and Hitler's Nazis. Many jobless swelled the ranks of Hitler's private army, the brown-shirted SA. He was able to use this during the 1930 Reichstag elections to impress the electorate with the growing power and will of the Nazi Party. The elections themselves were marked by much violence between the brown shirts and their communist rivals. The result of the 1930 elections was that both Nazis and communists made significant gains, but not enough for either to form a government. In spring 1932, Hitler was in a strong enough position to run for the presidency of Germany and attracted over a third of the votes. This was no mean accomplishment, since his main rival was the now aged but much revered Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, who had been president since 1925 and now won a further term. The Reichstag elections of the same year confirmed the Nazis as the largest party, although they did not have an overall majority. Hitler would not countenance a coalition, and the Nazis continued their displays of strength while fruitless inter-party negotiations continued. Events now moved fast. Von Hindenburg saw the only way out of the political impasse was to persuade Hitler to accept the chancellorship, which he did on the 30th of January 1933, although only 2 of his party were in the cabinet. A month later, there was a mysterious fire in the Reichstag, with a half-crazed Dutchman being blamed for it. In northern Italy, war veteran and journalist Benito Mussolini organized what would become a mass right-wing movement, the Fascists. In their early days, they were too nationalistic for most people's taste, but support for them soon grew. Mussolini worked hard to establish a power base in northern Italy. In August 1922, the government was unwilling to act firmly in the face of a general strike. Mussolini mobilized his black shirts and they marched on Rome. King Victor Emmanuel, fearful of a civil war, asked Mussolini to form a government. Mussolini moved quickly to stamp out all political opposition and assumed dictatorial powers. By 1928, his position was seemingly unassailable, with parliament appointed rather than elected, and power firmly in the hands of the fascist Grand Council.